Just wait for more people to join. Gavin, would you like to start?
Press the unmute button. Always a good start. Right, so hello to the people that are here at the moment. My name is Gavin Grant. I run Book Moon Bookshop in East Hampton, Massachusetts with my wife, Kelly Link. And we were delighted when the Strange Light reading series came to us and said, can we host some fabulous readings? And I'm sorry that Alex isn't here tonight, but the two of the people who run it, Nadia and Yvette, are here. Before I pass it over to them, we always do our little land acknowledgement. So Book Moon is on the land traditionally owned by the Pocumtuck people, and we wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. We'd also like to pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and Native elders in our local community. And with that, I'm out, and I pass it on to Nadia and Yvette for tonight's reading. Thank you. Strange Light.
Thank you, Gavin. Welcome to the Strange Light reading series, and we have two wonderful readers with us today. Before we start, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Alex, who couldn't join us tonight. She's the brains and the heart behind the Strange Light reading series, so wanted to send her some, love her way. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first reader, and congratulations to both our readers. We have Isabel Yap, who has an amazing debut short story collection, and Rebecca Roanhorse, who's just been announced as a Hugo finalist, so very exciting for both of them. And I'll introduce Rebecca, who will read first. Rebecca Roanhorse is a New York Times bestselling, Nebula, Hugo, and Locus Award-winning speculative fiction writer and the recipient of the 2018 Astounding Campbell Award for Best New Writer. Rebecca has published multiple award-winning short stories and 5 novels, including 2 in the Sixth World series, Star Wars, Resistance Reborn, Race to the Sun for the Rick Riordan imprint, and her latest novel, the epic fantasy Black Sun. She has also written for Marvel Comics and for television, and had projects optioned by Amazon Studios, Netflix, and Paramount TV. She lives in northern New Mexico with her husband, daughter, and pup. She drinks a lot of black coffee. Welcome, Rebecca Roanhorse, and virtual round of applause.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I am Rebecca Roanhorse, and I actually have my black coffee in hand as we speak. So even though it's, I think, 6 o'clock here, it's never too late for coffee. I just have a little time with you today before we get a taste of Isabel's exciting debut. So I was going to read to you from Black Sun, and we'll see how much time we have. If we have more time, I might read a little bit of a short story, but I think this will probably cover it. This is Black Sun. This is my, now I could say, Hugo nominated and Nebula nominated epic fantasy. For those of you who haven't read it, what are you doing? No, just kidding. There, a little bit about it. It is Mesoamerican inspired. So growing up and really through my entire life, I've always been a fan of epic fantasies. I grew up on Dragonlance and the Belgariad, and later A Song of Ice and Fire, and all those kinds of books. But I always wondered, or whether I always wanted to read a novel like that with all the grandeur and sort of scope of an epic fantasy, but inspired by the Americas, particularly the Mesoamericas. So think of like the Mayan, Aztec, the ancestral Puebloans, the people of Cahokia, which are like the Mississippi Mound Builders. So all those sorts of influences are the influences that went into Black Sun. But it is a fantasy. It is not historically accurate. And I did a lot of borrowing and mixing and things like that. So it's really more my inspiration and sort of my guiding light as I wrote this novel. And so the novel is told from 4 different points of view, 3 main points of view, and one that comes in later. One of them is a God reborn. I think it's okay to tell you that. Another is a bit of a disaster of a sea captain with special powers that she has yet to realize. And the third main point of view is the sun priest, Narampa. And so I'm going to read from her today, a little about Narampa. She is definitely a woman from the wrong side of the track. She lives in the holy city of Tova, was raised in the Ma, Coyote's Ma, which is sort of like the more seedy part of town, but rose to prominence as the sun priest. And I always describe her as a woman who loves an institution that does not love her back. And this is the beginning of her story. Chapter 3. Narampa was not dead, even though the witch Satea thought her so. She could not move her limbs or open her eyes, and her breath came out in an almost imperceptible wheeze, but she could hear and more so feel everything that was happening to her. She felt the apprentice's hands, 2 girls who strained and heaved as they dragged her from the river. She heard Zatea order them to build up the fire, and then she breathed in the smoke the witch fanned from the flames. She screamed without sound at the hot, thick drip of blood against her naked chest, and then at Zatea's command to her apprentices to spread the blood evenly over Narampa's supine form. And as the witch covered her with a blanket, pausing only to pry her mouth open and place a salt rock under her tongue, Narampa wept unnoticed tears. Narampa had been a child once, long before she joined the priesthood, before she learned to read the course of the sun and command sky-made queens. She had been a beggar in the poor district of Tova called Coyote's Ma. Often when the streets were quiet before the evening crowd of gamblers, tourists, and pleasure seekers arrived in the Ma, Narampa had sat on the westernmost ledge of the top level of the district and peered out over the dizzying distances that separated her home from the wealthier neighborhoods. Looking out over the city, she had dreamed of crossing the woven suspension bridges that swayed like spider silk in the gentle canyon breezes and allowed free travel among all the districts but hers, of exploring the wide roads and stately adobe brick homes, some 4 and 5 stories high, not as a servant like her mother, but as someone who belonged there. And brashest of all, Narampa had dreamed of being a scholar in the celestial tower in the district of Otsa. She was only 10 then, her destiny far from decided. She had not yet learned she was poor, and people like her only went to the celestial tower as servants, or that once you were poor, people hated you for it, even when you weren't poor anymore. She remembered a summer night she sat with her family around the cooking coals they shared with their neighbors, talking about how she wished to study the stars. In the sky-made districts, the scions ate on great communal terraces where kitchens produced food for hundreds. But in the Ma, people kindled small dugout fires in the streets where they roasted ground cornmeal or buried whole ears of corn in hot ash to bake overnight. At her words, her mother had exchanged a mysterious glance with her father, and he had nodded. "It is good fortune that you would talk of studying the stars tonight, Nara," her mother said, her voice high with excitement. "I spoke to the matron I serve, and she remembered you and how smart you are and how well you learn, and she has agreed to sponsor you at the Celestial Tower." Narampa felt dizzy. I'm going to be a scholar priest? She knew there were other disciplines one could learn at the tower: healing, writing, and history, even the art of death. But all she had ever wanted was to study the sun and moon and the movement of the stars. Her father laughed. "Oh, no, little one. They would never let you study there. You are to work. You will serve the priests, help cook their meals, wash their vestments, clean their floors." Her stomach dropped in disappointment. But Her mother gave her father a long look. Perhaps you will learn something if you listen closely. A servant can learn a lot through observation if she is quiet. Then I will be quiet, she vowed solemnly, and I will learn everything. That's not fair, her younger brother, Dena Oche, protested. Why does she get to go and not me? Who wants to be a priest when you could be one of the Sky Maid scions? Her other brother, Akal, asked. Narampa bit her lip. Being Sky Maid was exciting. Water Strider was her favorite clan, and its matron was the one her mother served. It ruled the district of Tididi, which was closest to the maw. She could see the curving edges of its cliffs when she gazed across the narrow canyon that divided them, its great sky blue banners cascading down the sides of adobe buildings between dripping green vines and colorful tendrils of starburst flowers. She could even see trees there. Trees. The maw had no trees. Tididi was a garden of impossible green and growth, with a waterfall that ran right through it like a living street before tumbling to the river that bisected Tova below. When her mother talked of it, she imagined Tididi was something out of a story, a place she could only hear about, but never touch. But now, what clan would you be, Akal? She asked. Why would anyone want to be anything but Golden Eagle? Everyone knows they are the most powerful of the 4 clans. Not if we go to war, Akal counseled. You want to ride on the back of a water insect when we go to war? He lifted his sharp chin. I'll be on the back of an eagle, shitting down on you. Not a water strider, a winged serpent. Same difference. Akal lunged at his little brother, but Dena Oche easily dodged his half-hearted blow. What's this talk of war, their father said, rough anger coloring his voice. Tova does not war. We have been at peace for 300 years since the priesthood united us. Akal's the one who wants to go to war. I want to rule. Dena Oche's face was so smug, Narampa could only laugh. Boys don't rule in Tova, Akal countered. Besides, all you could ever rule is a sewer pile. You and your shitting birds. I'm going to the war college in Hokaia with the scions. There I'll learn to fight. Enough, their father muttered. You don't know what you're talking about, either of you. Do I have fools for sons, dreaming of being lords and warriors? You'll be lucky to find work in the mines or in the fields in the east. The war college is not for the likes of you, Akal. If war comes, you will be nothing but fodder, or worse, a sacrifice on a foreign altar where the sun priest has not brought enlightenment. And you, Ochi, Akal's right. The only place you'll ever rule is right here in the maw, and there's nothing here worth reigning over but trash. Jema, her mother chided her husband. They're only children. They're too old for nonsense. Remember well, you're no Sky Maid scions, and you never will be. Get those thoughts out of your head or court misery the rest of your life. Silence fell across the small family in the wake of her father's reprimand. Her mother said nothing, but Narampa could see her disapproval clear enough in the set of her jaw and the look in her eyes. When I go to the Celestial Tower in Otsa, I'll bring you all to visit me, Narampa offered, trying to soothe the mood. And you can ride an eagle, Ochi, and you a winged serpent, Akal, but not to war, just for fun. I said enough fool talk, her father grumbled, sounding more tired than angry. You too, Nara, no more. Her promise to her brothers had not come to fruition, of course. Not only because the riders of the great Sky Maid clan's beasts were lords even among the scions and specifically chosen from their clans to train for years before they were allowed mounts, but also because by the time Narampa did leave her home and move to Otsa to become not just a servant, although she had been that, and not just a dedicant, although she was that too, but the sun priest, its highest honor. By that time, her older brother was dead, and her younger brother dead in spirit. She was not sure of her parents' final fates, but she assumed them dead too. She had never gone back to find out, because her father had been right. The truth was that as much as she loved the city did not love her back. It had little use for a ma beggar girl, some use for a clever servant who caught the attention of the aging and eccentric sun priest, more use for an unlikely dedicant who had an uncanny ability to read the stars and outshine her society classmates, and a final and blistering use for an idealistic young sun priest who thought she could make a change to her beloved city, but instead made only enemies. Again and again, Tova forced herself to earn its regard, and she had done so every time. She comforted herself with the fact that she had not done it for glory or for power, but for the worst reason of all, faith. Faith in this place she called home. But, she thought, as she lay under the witch's blanket, plagued by memories of her childhood and her foolish fantasies, blood drying on her skin and salt burning her mouth, faith is not going to save me now. And that is my reading. Oh, good. And I'm just right on time, I think. So, yay. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk or am I just supposed to hand it over to Isabel? Isabel, take it away.
Actually, I'd like to introduce Isabel first. So, Isabel Yap writes fiction and poetry and works in the tech industry and drinks tea. Born and raised in Manila, she has also lived in California and London. She holds a BS in marketing from Santa Clara University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. In 2013, she attended the Clarion Writers Workshop and since 2016 has served as the secretary for the Clarion Foundation. Her work has appeared in venues including Tor.com, Lightspeed, Strange Horizons, Year's Best Weird Fiction. Her debut short story collection, Never Have I Ever, was published by Small Beer Press in February of 2021. That's all. Welcome, Isabel.
Thanks, Nadia. And Rebecca, I loved that reading. I felt it sort of like seeping into my brain. And I'm definitely excited to read your book because I think it will help me a lot with my work in progress. So yeah, that got me super excited. And I did want to say thanks to everyone attending. I can't see your lovely faces, but I see friends on here. So very appreciative of you guys spending time with us. When I was thinking about which story to read, I thought, I'll go and pick one from the collection. And I did want to read something with Tagalog in it, just so I could subject you all to that language. But as I was trying out different stories yesterday, I found myself getting really sad because I write a lot of sad stories. And the one that I was thinking of reading, Asphalt River, Mother Child, I just could not bring myself to read given everything. So I decided to pick something quite happy. I'm going to be reading A Spell for Foolish Hearts. It's a new story. It is a novelette. It takes place in San Francisco in a tech startup. So very similar to some environments I've worked at for my day job. And yeah, I'm going to be reading from the start of the story. And it's a little bit more lighthearted than a lot of the other ones. So hopefully folks will enjoy. Okay, A Spell for Foolish Hearts. The rule book for witches had over 300 entries, but Aunt Gemma stressed only 3. 1. Tend to your jar of blackberries. 2. Beware men's hearts, never let them be your master. 3. The shape of things can be deceptive. She'd copied them by hand on cardstock, drawn a row of hearts and stars as a border, then tucked it into the front cover of the rule book, which she sent Patrick for his 11th birthday. He read it all the way through twice, wondering if he should tell Mom and Dad. It was weird, the wondering. Why shouldn't he tell them? Aunt Gemma never said it was secret, and it didn't seem prohibited per witch laws because he carried the book around in plain sight. Once, over breakfast, Mom asked him, "What are you reading?" He answered, "The rule book for witches." She smiled fondly because her son was a bookworm and she probably thought this was a Harry Potter spinoff. Gradually, Patrick understood, without wanting to, that he was afraid of telling them because they'd either not believe it or it would upset them. There would be something inherently wrong in the revelation that Patrick was a witch. Both those reactions would hurt because he was a witch. He'd been doing spells for years, he just didn't know they were spells until Aunt Gemma sent him the book. Magic thrummed in his veins, sparking off him in small gestures, in the words he'd mutter under his breath, in the look he'd give a wailing toddler in the food court, don't do that, so that they'd snap their mouths shut and stare at him, affronted. He already knew that few people could do magic, but it didn't make you all-powerful. It was rare, but only in the sense that being really good at instruments or sports was rare. It could be used or not, and you could develop it or not. It could be noticed or ignored. The longing to tell his parents swelled. He felt as if there was a jar of water balanced on his head whenever they were around. The worst was the hope that Mom might say, "Oh, don't worry, I'm that way too," carelessly waving a hand to revive the dead herbs by the kitchen sink. Or Dad might admit that he wasn't afraid of cats, he just didn't like hearing their thoughts. When he finally told them, Mom cried, quiet tears running down her cheeks, the lack of drama highlighting how truly sad it made her. Dad turned away and muttered something under his breath. "Are you sure?" Mom asked. Patrick nodded. "I should have known," Mom sniffled. "It runs in my side of the family. Mother had it, and so did Gemma, but I thought it might be thinned out between me and your dad. Damn it, Gemma should have asked me first." "One of my cousins has it too," Dad said sheepishly. Mom said, "Alan." They started arguing while Patrick sat on his hands and marveled at his shame. He should have kept his mouth shut. At least he wasn't crying. Mom blew her nose and said, "No, it's not something he can go to the doctor for. It's not a big deal," Patrick blurted. He felt awful. His parents looked at him. "I mean, no one really needs to know, and I've never shown it off. Most people don't notice magic unless they're looking. It'll be fine." "You mean you won't?" Mom paused, considering her words. "You won't be a witch?" Patrick said, faltering. That seemed impossible to answer. "I'll, try." That conversation was 16 years ago. Though some mornings halfway through coffee number 1, Patrick recalled it with crystal precision. He wondered what he could have said instead. Yes would be wrong. No was inaccurate. 11-year-old Patrick had done his best. There weren't massive consequences either. Sometimes you needed to get the bad feelings out of your system, cry and argue, and plod on. They rarely spoke of his witchcraft after that. Patrick continued to work minor spells because he couldn't not, but being a witch didn't spell his doom. He didn't run away from home, quit school, or launch a drug cartel like maybe his parents feared. He went to college and got his degree in physics on a whim with a minor in design. Patrick felt he was doing a decent job of adulting. He had work as a UX/UI marketing designer at a fast-growing VC-backed startup, air quotes, not because these statements were untrue, but because they were so typical, and an apartment in San Francisco, tiny, out in the Richmond, but it was all he needed. He knew where to get quarters for his laundry. He paid off his credit card every month. His only witchy activity was the part-time work at the Mission Spell Shop just off Valencia Street, mostly because Myrtle was a sweetheart who let him tinker with ingredients. They donated some of their proceeds to a nearby shelter program, which served both magical and non-magical folks alike. It was nice to stay tangentially connected to the Bay Area magic scene, even if most people were hobbyists like him. Rent was too high, magic too impractical. There were much more lucrative ways to spend one's time. The rulebook he kept on his nightstand, the note card on his refrigerator. Sometimes he wondered if maybe he'd taken those rules too seriously. Number 1, he'd followed faithfully after Mother gave him his blackberry jar. "I have no idea what it's for, but I kept it anyway upon Grandma's orders, so you might as well have it." He didn't exactly tend it. He just wiped dust off the lid every few months. Number 3 seemed fairly obvious, less a witch rule than common sense, though he suspected it might hold some deeper meaning about fae or humanesque glamours. Number 2 he'd never had experience with because he'd never been in a relationship. Patrick didn't know how to be in one. He wasn't dissatisfied with being single. Most days, he didn't even think of it. Now that he was on the other side of 25, it seemed unlikely to change unless he had one of those movie-like encounters in an airport or a party. He didn't go to parties. He'd been on a dating app for all of 3 days before deciding it was too stressful and deleting his account. He wasn't sure how to feel about being single. He wasn't sure he felt much about it. It was sad in this remote way, like an acquaintance's tragedy. He could empathize with it to a degree. On the other hand, he was certain he'd saved himself a lot of personal drama by never falling for anyone. He didn't even know how to fall for someone. The concept was mysterious. Did you choose to be attracted? Did you pluck someone from your environment and decide to attach feelings to them? If all of media was to be believed, he was highly unusual in this regard, but it didn't exactly bother him. He'd never even had a real crush. Besides Ben Whishaw, he was really into Ben Whishaw, but Ben Whishaw was a celebrity and taken, so. Sometimes Kat, who ran product marketing at his startup, tried to cure his remarkable lack of dating by inviting him to go dancing in the Castro. Kat was very concerned for Patrick's happiness, which was sometimes exhausting, but he liked Kat a lot, so he didn't mind. He thought life would probably be a lot easier if he and Kat could be a couple. Kat was sweet and took excellent care of him, and they could have had a very happy life together. Only he wasn't into women, and she wasn't into long-term relationships. Kat was the only person at work who knew about the witch thing and the gay thing, and Patrick intended to keep it that way. Monday. There was a boy with hair made of starlight in the elevator. He blinked luminous gray eyes at Patrick as he stepped inside and parted bow-shaped lips to say, "Thank God, I was starting to think I'd have to take the stairs the whole way." Patrick was halfway through a Starbucks white chocolate mocha, which he only indulged in on days that started out not good. His hair was not good that morning. His face was not good. He had mystery sniffles and he'd overslept. He flinched, but it was only a mental flinch, a jolt of feeling that ran through him, so unexpected he barely had the composure to say, hi. He blinked. The boy's hair wasn't starlight, just a bleached platinum that really shouldn't have worked. He wore a stud earring and a dangling earring in one lobe like a K-pop star, a dark blue button-down under a tailored jacket with elbow patches, and new-looking Cole Haans. "What floor?" he asked. "6th. I didn't realize the elevator needed a card reader. I'm surprised no one else came in. Is everyone here fit enough to take the stairs?" "It's Health Awareness Month," Patrick said and tapped his card on the reader. "It's also a little early for most people. Only weirdos like Patrick came in at 8:30. When Patrick didn't press any other button, Starboy said, "Well, seems like we're headed to the same place." Marquette? Their core product was a platform for quantifying the impact of various marketing activities across the funnel. One of the co-founders had thought the name incredibly clever. Most employees disagreed but were resigned. "Yeah," Starboy says. "I start today, product team, I'm Carl." He stuck his hand out and Patrick shook it. "Carl, like the fog?" "What?" Awkward. The elevator door slid open. "Oh, it's a Twitter account. Carl the Fog, haha." "Oh, yeah, it's Carl with a K." "I'm Patrick," he said, trying not to feel like an idiot. "I'm on the design team. I would take you to HR, but I'm not sure she's in yet. Do you want some coffee?" "Coffee would be great." They walked into the kitchen, where Melody was starting to unpack the weekly Costco delivery. "Hey, another newbie today. You guys are multiplying." As she and Carl started chatting, Patrick busied himself making coffee for the early birds. He pictured his blackberry jar to calm down. He felt ridiculous. Starboy, Carl, was not even his type. That hair, for one thing. Patrick had never known what a crush was like, and if this was it was a bad idea. He was a firm believer in keeping work and personal life separate. That shit was messy, and if there was one thing Patrick did not like, it was messy shit. Plus, he didn't really believe in things like attraction at first sight, even if those were awfully nice Cole Haans. Carl was good at his job, efficient and communicative, confident but not controlling. The first product Carl and Patrick collaborated on was a long-awaited V2 feature release spurred by vicious tweets from angry users, #Marquit. Patrick initially felt sorry for Carl. He'd been given a shitty project, shipping something that already fostered negative sentiment. But Carl had risen to the task admirably, translating all that user fury into clear pain points that Patrick could actually design solutions for. They'd sat in a brainstorming session together for half a day, and at the end of it, they had 3 options to show the rest of the team. Patrick had actually been excited to get back to his desk and prototype. It was the good kind of startup rush. Talking to Carl, picking his brain, felt easy. Carl was also super friendly. By the end of week 1, everyone knew his name, which was rare given how many newbies started each week. He and Kat got along amazingly. They quickly established weekly lunch dates, which made Patrick slightly jealous, of whom he wasn't sure. Kat, being Kat, looped Patrick in, so he found himself spending a lot more time with Carl than expected. Before he knew it, his Slack convo with Carl was a minefield of gifts. They regularly ate lunch together, and he'd spent more than a couple nights in a stupor, lamenting the unfortunate problem of crushing on a coworker. It sucked. Denying the crush had worked for all of 2.5 weeks, but eventually Patrick admitted defeat. He mused on this while making bacon pasta for dinner. He was cat-sitting Miranda for Aunt Gemma. She blinked at him owlishly from the counter, judging his agony. He did not want to like Carl. He was not prepared for this stupid crush. Why should he have a crush at all? And on Carl. He didn't even know Carl. Well, he knew some things. Carl was a Bay Area native, and most of his family was still here. He'd gone to school at Berkeley, studied economics with a minor in art history. He was bad at sports, but liked long walks. And hiking, but I know literally everyone likes hiking. I'm not like the best hiker, I just like trees, haha. He claimed to enjoy karaoke and museums, and once he'd brought in a Tupperware full of white chocolate chip and macadamia cookies that he'd baked from scratch. Before Marquette, he'd worked at another startup which had tanked after its Series A. Before that, he'd been at Apple. It was unclear how old he was, and he didn't have LinkedIn. Patrick also knew that Carl moved like water, like he was possessed by some internal rhythm. He crossed the room in liquid strides and teleported from either end of the whiteboard when Patrick wasn't paying attention, which in this situation was almost never. Perhaps he'd been a dancer in undergrad. Also, apparently Carl didn't bleach his hair. It was that color naturally. Some genetic mutation, Carl said laughingly, and Patrick had thought, what, for hotness? Patrick was constantly hunting for clues about whether Carl liked men. Had he ever mentioned an ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend? Had he ever mentioned a type? Patrick did not know how to broach queerness without bringing it up himself, hence, never. Anyway, nothing was going to happen. They did not hang outside of work. I can be his friend, Patrick said aloud. He flapped a hand at Miranda, vaguely worried that her hair would get in the pasta. He's a great work friend, a great colleague. We probably wouldn't enjoy weekends together anyway. He set the timer 1 minute less than the package stated and stirred sauce in an adjacent pot. I don't even know if he likes boys. He probably doesn't. And yes, he's really nice to me, but he's also nice to everyone. That's just how he is. That morning, Carl had randomly brought him a white chocolate mocha with matching milky smile. This is for turning those mocks around so quickly, he'd said. Patrick didn't think he'd been particularly efficient. He tried not to read into it. Thanks, dude, but now I owe you one. Carl said, okay, you can get the next one, and walked off to get his requisite granola from the pantry. That smile, though. What was it about that smile? He missed his timer. The noodles weren't firm. Miranda meowed thoughtfully at him as he slurped dinner and resolved to get through this. And then they go to San Francisco Pride, but that's where I'll stop reading.
Thank you both for those wonderful readings. Trying very hard not to fangirl. We'll transition to the Q&A portion. So the first question is from Chloe, and it's for Isabel. I've been to a witchy apothecary shop in Valencia in the Mission called the Scarlet Sage. Was this your inspiration for this shop described in the story?
No, I haven't been to Scarlet Sage, but now you're making me want to check it out. So I didn't have a particular shop in mind, but if you've been to the Mission in SF, you know that it's got just a lot of cool stores, and it really was the kind of place where I could imagine some kind of random spell shop. So no real life inspiration, just the vibe of the place in general.
Really cool. The second question is for Rebecca, and it's from Marissa. With your book, it feels like every word choice mattered and like it contributed to the overall atmosphere and imagery. Is there a particular draft stage where you build these kinds of word choices into the story? Or does this kind of sensibility tend to be part of your projects from the very first draft?
Mm. Well, I am in the middle of revisions for book 2, so that's pretty fresh on my mind. So I guess the first draft, I tend to draft relatively clean. I'm not like the person who just, gets everything out all at once and then goes through 6 or 7 revisions. My first draft is actually pretty solid. And then my second draft, I will go through and refine word choice and dialogue. And often in my first draft, I will skip description. I'm not a huge fan, or it doesn't come naturally. It's a little more work for me. So maybe in the second draft, I will go through and try to really, once I have the plot and I understand all the characters, and sort of what's going on, I will go through and like add description. And then, your word choice, of course, because I always want descriptions to reflect the point of view of whoever is giving the description. So even if it's like close third, I want it to feel like, what they see when they look at something, like how they would describe it. And so then I am much more picky about my words. The first time I'm like, there's some trees and then there's a bridge. And can we stop talking about that now? No. So yeah. And then by third draft, I'm pretty solid and I'm going into copy edits. So, but then I'll nitpick at it forever until they take it away from me. So yeah.
I really love it when authors admit to being clean first drafters, because I feel like there's so many people who are always like, first draft is such a huge mess. And I'm like, not for everyone necessarily.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm kind of, well, I was going to say I'm slow, but I don't know. It's all relative, right? How fast you draft. So who knows?
Yeah.
Kind of on the same topic for both of you. What were the biggest changes that your projects went through in between the initial idea and publication?
Oh, Isabel, you can go first.
Yeah. So it really depends on the story. Some of them came out luckily like as is. I say that, but it's hard for me to remember, but I'll say like in the collection, 3 of those stories were written at Clarion in 2013. And they were, written in the span of like a week or 2. And what my classmates read is very similar to what eventually got published and then recollected in this collection like 8 years later. So that was just, I think of those as like gift stories. Like I was just very lucky to get them. And my revision was mostly line edits. For something like A Spell for Foolish Hearts, there were chunks of it that, so this is new to me, this process of like finishing something and then I finish it and I feel like it's ugly and not right, but maybe not hopelessly broken. And so that was the case for A Spell for Foolish Hearts. Like I was, freestyling it as I always do, and I finished it and I was not happy with it. But I didn't quite know what was wrong with it. And I let it sit for basically a year and a half before I went back to it. And when I read it, I realized, for example, there's a scene in this story where Patrick goes to a house party in San Francisco and he's very awkward and just feels very out of his depth with all the like hot people around him. In the original version, he and Carl actually went to the I'm blanking on the name, but it's a museum in Golden Gate Park, like the Museum of Honor. And so it was just the two of them, hanging out in the museum. And in both scenes, my intention was to make Patrick think there's no way I can end up with this person. So in the original, it was a museum scene. In the revision, it was this house party scene. And I knew what the scene needed to do. I just needed to like rewrite it entirely. And I'm finding I'm needing to do that more and more, especially for longer stories. So if I can get to the end of a scene and move on, then I'll try to do that. But sometimes it's just so bad that I have to keep on deleting and trying again. Like my writing group knows, with the thing I'm currently drafting, I like deleted and retried this chapter like 3 times at this point. So very painful, with much pain always is the revision.
I have a painful revision story for Black Sun too. So I drafted probably 95K, like 95,000 word draft, the first draft of Black Sun, turned it into my editor. And I was very excited to hear what he had to say. We were actually at Boscone, which is a science fiction and fantasy convention in Boston. And finally we sat down. We were going to have a little dinner or something. I can't remember. But I was like, so what do you think? What do you think? I wrote this story like in my head and then I have it on paper. What do you think? And he's like, it's okay. It's okay. And he sort of changes the subject. And so I'm thinking, it's okay. It's okay. I don't write okay. I need to write great. So, and he insists that he said it was good, but I remember it as him saying it was just okay. So I took that draft back and I just tore it apart. From that first draft, I kept, I think, a couple of character names, the general setting, but nothing else. And I totally rewrote the novel from scratch because I was so bad because I just did not want to write just okay. And so that one actually had a full, I guess I wouldn't even call it a revision. That was just a totally different story than what I had originally started as. And it took like another year, but it got done. And then, went through its regular revision process. But, sometimes that happens. Sometimes you just write the wrong story. And he was right that the first version of it was just okay. And the second version of it, I pushed harder, I took more risks. I did things that I wouldn't have done probably a year before as a writer even. And it was much, much better.
I have a follow-up question to this because this is like fascinating to me. How did you know what to do? Like, it sounds like he didn't even give you clues as to what in the story was or wasn't working. So
yeah, so now it is a little fuzzy. Someone had said this, and so now I go by this, like writing a novel is a bit like childbirth. Like if you remembered how painful it was, you wouldn't do it again. And now it's just sort of fuzzy in my head, like the whole thing. But basically, I knew I wanted one character that I had sort of fallen in love with, and that was Shiala from the first draft. And she was a sea captain. And I knew I wanted to keep her. And so I really rebuilt the story around her. I was like, okay, so I need a sea captain. So I need a maritime culture. So I did research on the maritime Maya because I wasn't even sure there was like a seafaring culture in Mesoamerica. I mean, I knew there had to be because there's a big Gulf of Mexico there. But what did that look like? And what kind of ships did they have? And so I sort of built out of that. And then I was like, well, I want an all-female society. So I sort of built her society out of that. And then the book sort of became about her passenger, Serapio, and I let him take the lead in the book because it felt like that's, what they wanted to do. But it's really their journey together that's the heart of the story. And it just sort of blossomed out from there. So I world build from character out. So I don't really know my setting until I know my characters. Then I let them lead. And that's sort of what happened. I mean, I guess technically I could have taken it back to my editor and he could have been like, this too is just okay. But, thankfully he did not.
There are a lot of people who are drafting novels in the audience, so I think this is very relatable to them. And the next question, I think you kind of touched upon it a bit. It's from LP Kindred. Where do your story seeds start, and how do you nurture them?
I can answer. Where do they start? Anywhere. I answered an interview for Book Moon actually, where this was one of the questions. And for me, it can be anything from like a line to an image to just even like a sensation, and how much I get for every story differs. You know, there's one story in the book, it's called Have You Heard the One About Ana Maria Marquez? And I knew the general setting would be a Catholic school, like the one I attended as a kid. So I didn't have to do much digging for that. But I also knew I wanted it to end with a feeling like there's a ghost whispering in your ear. Like I want you to feel it like in the back of your head. So I knew that was like the ending, but I knew nothing about the story until I started writing it. I have another story, it's not in the collection, but it's called The Oiran Song. It's set in like a historical Japan, vague wartime era in the snow. And when I was like 12, I just had this image. I really like this video game Tenchu, Stealth Assassins, which is like ninjas, and then you go around creeping around like killing people. And I was like, I just like that video game. And then I had this image in my head of like, well, what if like this is never going to happen in the video game, but what if one of the characters was like a courtesan, you know, and she's secretly like an assassin? Wouldn't that be cool? And then like the snow would have like blood on it. Like that was the aesthetic. And then some years later, I read this manga by Clamp called Yuki Onna, which had that kind of imagery. And then some years later, I read another manga called Lady Snowblood. So I had all these images in my head for many years, but I didn't, you know, think I'm going to be able to write that story until much later. And then, you know, at that point, there were many things I didn't know, like, is the main character soldier like a boy or a girl? Like, I don't know. I have to try writing the story before I understand what the story wants to be. So it's a very unscientific woo-woo process, and that's just how it is. And embracing that, like embracing how much I don't know and how much I need to let the story lead me, which is why I really loved Rebecca's description of how her process was such a huge like change for me over the last, I want to say 5 years. Like it was so painful to get to a point where I admitted that I just have to write it. I cannot plan. So yeah, that's me.
So do you consider yourself a very visual writer? Like I love that you have these images and then that's what you build the story from. Because I'm sort of the same way.
Yeah, and I could feel it in the passages you were reading. Like I could see the video cam of your character and how that creates the world building. And I would say not always, but sometimes. And increasingly these days, one of the things I tell myself is like, what if this were an anime? Or what if this were like a panel in a manga? Like how would this scene look? And that's a lot more comforting to my brain than questions like, what are the stakes? Or what do the characters want? Like that doesn't do it for me. But okay, if this were a manga, what would like the splash page be? Does. So yeah, quite some stories are very visual for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm the same way. I was just gonna say, I was just thinking, I think for me, I'll often visualize a scene, and then I feel like it's my job just to record on paper what that scene looks like, or like what's going on and like what the characters are saying, as if I'm sort of overhearing it. And so I have a sort of a woo-woo process too. And then maybe on an edit, maybe on a revision, then I go back and I think, well, what are the stakes, or what does this character really want, or like something like that. But I think that first pass, besides the emotionality, I'm always going for sort of the punch in the gut, or the oof, or I want you to have all the feels when you're reading my stories. But besides that, yeah, it's all just pictures, images that I'm getting down on paper.
I want to +1 the emotionality too. Like that is a focus for me. Such as when I was describing A Spell for Foolish Hearts, the feeling was supposed to be, there's no way in heck I can date this guy. but the specifics were very vague.
Right.
So yes, that is totally resonating.
Here's another one from our Q&A for both of you. What do you think is the most fun or most challenging part of creating unique magic systems in your stories?
I want to hear your answer, Rebecca.
Oh gosh, I was like, no, go first so I can think about it. You know, I guess for me, I'm trying to think, particularly, well, I'll talk about Black Sun. I think it's a little different, maybe for each novel or for each series. For Black Sun, the magic system was very organic. My editor, and actually he had said this in my first novel too, so maybe this is just a thing. He's like, usually I make my authors write out what their magic system is because I want it to be like logically sound. He's like, but I'm not going to make you do that because there's just something about the book that it feels organic. And so I think that that's probably what I do. I don't think coherently through my magic system, which maybe I should. But if it feels right, it will start to grow on its own. And I'll come up with certain elements like in Black Sun, like I know that like there's sort of like there's sorcery and then there's witchcraft, and that's really a class difference as opposed to an actual difference in the magic. And I know that the gods, you know, that the magic comes from like the bones and the remains of gods. But, you know, what that means, you know, we'll see as the characters start to use it, you know, and in book 2, there's actually a lot more magic than there is in book 1. And so that's just me sort of organically on the fly developing the magic system as I go. So yeah, not a lot of planning actually. What about you, Isabel?
I'm the same way. I can't even like the word magic system just like bounces off my story brain. Like it doesn't even compute for me, which it's interesting because I think some people might say there is kind of a magic system in some of my stories, but it is also very organic and intuition based. And yeah, I don't know. I think the one note I have for magic is I do like a feeling of it being earned. And so one of the pegs that I think about is the anime Full Metal Alchemist, where it's very clear it's alchemy, right? And he's always like, I'm going to give something up to get something. I can't do it that cleanly in my work, also because I just don't know. You know, I feel like to build a magic system, you have to know a lot of specific things. And I'm like, I don't know. So I'm just using my characters as the guide. But I will say too, I guess the other thing I can draw from is that magic is not, it is organic to my culture too. And there is magic in the Philippines, and there are witches and ghosts and like spells. And if I cross a anthill under a tree, I will say like, excuse me to the anthill so I don't get cursed by, you know, a dwarf. Like that's just how magic has existed for me. I have friends with open third eyes, you know, like, so in a way that there's no system to it, it's just folded into our lives. And what I try to do in the stories is pull it out more and then try to make it like a personal experience to the character.
I love that, Isabel. And I think this speaks to like the next question from Shingai, which is how do your cultural experiences and histories influence the stories you tell? How do you balance how much of yourself you put into your worlds with universal experiences?
Do you want to take that one first?
No, I want to hear your answer again.
So I don't think I can divorce my culture from my storytelling. It's just, it's always from an Indigenous or a Black perspective. I don't know what else to write or how else to write. So it's sort of a difficult question in that sense. I think it probably informs what my interests are, like what story I want to tell. how I'm going to tell it. I think what Isabel just said was such a good example of like, there's just a cultural lens through which you see something like magic that is perhaps outside of sort of the US centric mainstream, that is just part of who you are. And that ends up on the page, that ends up on in your story, because you can't really divorce yourself from it, nor should you try. Because the truth is that's what makes you the author that you are. And that's what makes the story, unique to you. Kind of, yeah. Does that help to answer it? I think that's sort of my answer.
Yeah, I want to add to that by saying like I firmly believe that like you as the author, whatever you're writing, for example, the Oiran song, which I mentioned earlier, or A Spell for Foolish Hearts, where Patrick, the main character, I don't ever call out what his nationality is. So you can paint him as whatever generic San Francisco millennial you like. But because I wrote them, they're Filipino stories in a way, which is kind of strange. I think, and maybe other authors would disagree with me, but that's just my truth with my writing, is because I'm the one writing it and I am, a queer female Filipino immigrant, then that's just going to inform the story no matter what the actual like writing is. So, I'm very resistant to the idea that you have to claim certain identities and that you can only write to those identities. But this is a very sensitive topic that I know other authors will and should feel differently about. And in this question, I think like putting yourself into your worlds with universal experiences, I think it's interesting because even like writing Filipino stories, and I think Rebecca, maybe you feel this too, like the Philippines is not a monolith, it's an archipelago. There's like many, many different cultures. And I am working on a project that draws from different traditions. There's a book in my collection, or sorry, there's a story in my collection called How to Swallow the Moon, that draws from different traditions. And it uses this mythological creature, the Bakunawa, but in some parts of the Philippines, it's a Minokawa and it's not a dragon, it's a rooster, right? Like, I am a Manila girl. I grew up in the capital. So, my legends and my stories are just from all over the islands, and the legends and myths that I read growing up are from all over. And I have a lot of fear and like anxiety around like mashing up those cultures, but that's also like what I can do, with my Filipino-ness. And it's also the story I want to tell. So it's just like, to me, I always try to think what is in service of the story first. And if I tell the story honestly and, within the research that I can get, if I tell it like with a respectful spirit, then that's pretty much the only thing I can hope for. But again, tricky, hairy, scary to be made to speak for a culture too. I think I don't want to do that, but it is like a responsibility that authors from certain cultures carry.
Yeah, and I'll just touch on the second half of that. I went and looked at the question because I couldn't remember. They're like, how much of yourself do you put into it? The specificity versus the universal experience. And I think as an author, you always go for specificity. That's where the universal experience lies. So I don't know if that makes sense, but the more specific you are, the more unique you are in your perspective, the more universal the story becomes. And it's kind of ironic, but that's sort of the way it works. So I put probably too much of myself. I put 110% of myself in my stories. That is my trauma on the page, my issues on the page. But I know that they become universal once I articulate them, because people tell me that they're universal, that they've been through that too. They know that experience too. Even if it's different cultures, there are so many parallels, in the way that our cultures are treated, or in the way that, the experiences that we've been through, that people see themselves in my story.
I think it's the sincerity, and the authenticity that will resonate And I think specificity, like the word precision is what I've been thinking about, but specificity is really good too. When you get to that level, then that is what creates the feelings, which are universal.
Yes.
So here's a question from Heron. What was your experience writing personal fiction before entering traditional publication? Was publishing something you always wanted to pursue?
For me, no. So I came to publishing a little late. I've had various other careers. The career I had before I became a full-time writer, I was an attorney. And I was sort of a miserable attorney. It was okay, but no, it was terrible. It wasn't even okay. I had always written just for pleasure. It was sort of my happy place, I guess. And so I found myself, with a small child and a job that I didn't enjoy, looking for some sort of happy place. And so I went back to writing. And that first novel I wrote, Trail of Lightning, I wrote purely for myself. That was my 10 to 12 at night, or 10 to 2 at night after my daughter had gone to bed, sitting by her bedside, just writing a story to escape. I was a huge urban fantasy fan. I had just come from living on the Navajo Nation. And so that was sort of my playground. And also, like I just said, my trauma, my place to work out, some of my issues and stuff, but I never thought it would see the light of day. And I had joined NaNoWriMo purely to make myself go write on Saturdays, because there was a writing group that got together and did that. And after the month of November, we stayed together, the writing group. I finished the novel. They were like, you should try to query this. And I was like, what does that mean? What is querying? I didn't even know. I knew nothing about publishing. But I did. I sent it out to some agents, into the slush pile, just cold. And my agent, I think she said she receives about 30,000 queries a year. She picks about 5 authors to represent,
Oh my
and she
God.
picked me. I know. So that's how that book got picked up, and we sold it within a week. And then, it took off from there. But I had always just written for pleasure. I love science fiction and fantasy. It was my happy place, my escape place. I never thought that a Black and Native woman could be a science fiction and fantasy writer, quite frankly. I thought that was the domain of white dudes. And some of them I love, but I just didn't know there was space for me there. And so that's sort of my story of how I became a writer. Yeah.
Yeah, some of that echoes mine, although I think I also had like a background that I think a lot of other authors now share. So I have also always loved writing, but I was in the habit of putting it out on the internet as fan fiction. So from the age of 8, I was online, had multiple identities where I learned punctuation very visibly on the internet and subjected strangers to my stories. And I was very multi-fandom. So, I've written for like, TV, movie, book, video game, anime. So just all over the place. Like if something ended and I was like, that was okay, but I want more, then I would just write my story and put it up online, which taught me that there were readers for my work. I think that was something very cool for a 14-year-old in the Philippines. And because of the time difference, when I would like post a story, I would go to sleep and wake up and, sometimes there would be comments, and that would be the best thing in the world for me. And I didn't really think about original writing. Like I had vague story ideas. I was, in my mind, I was like, one day I'm going to write a book. But similarly, it just didn't, like, there was no path to it. There was no path to like to me, books were like in New York, like that's where that happened. And, I was also a very practical kid from the start. So I knew that I was going to have to study something that wasn't writing. I kind of knew early on that I wanted to major in business because my parents were business people. And then in the Philippines too, if you like to write, you start to learn what the literary scene is there. So, you know, there are like you publish in university folios. That's like where you start. So kind of a lit fic route where you get involved with the literary community in your university and you publish stories, and then you like submit to the Palancas, which is a big literary award every year. So that was the path I was on, and I thought I was going to be a poet. And I didn't read a lot of traditional sci-fi and fantasy. I read tons of fanfic, and I read a lot of middle grade, and I read a lot of literary fiction. So those were sort of my pillars for writing. And then I moved to the States, and you know, that just was very wrenching for me. I was halfway through college. I lost my literary community. I was far from my friends, and at the same time, there were a lot of deaths in my family in sequence for different reasons, both my grandparents and then one of my younger cousins. So I was pretty depressed when I moved, and I wanted to keep writing, but I just didn't see how. And I felt like, oh, whatever I'd started in the Philippines, like I cannot progress that. I'm like not there. And there's no way in the vast America that I could pursue this. So I'll just keep writing fanfic, and then, you know, we'll see what happens. This is discounting the fact that I had published short stories in Filipino anthologies. And so that was something that I kept doing, but it was kind of an on-demand sort of activity for me. Like if there's an open call, I will submit. And this is why I write spec fic. I think it was because the publications that had open calls were spec anthologies. And then I would submit to those and they accepted them. And so, you know, if there is a reward, I will pursue it. So that was my take on it. And the thing that changed sort of how I viewed all of this was Clarion, which I applied to and attended mostly because Kelly Link, who is strangely enough my editor and publisher with Gavin, was teaching, and I had finished her short story collection and just thought it was amazing. So that's why I decided to apply that year, and you know, went in without any expectations, without knowing the history of the workshop, and was kind of like just like happily blank the whole time, I would say. But you know, my roommate was Alyssa Wong, so that kind of shows like the level that the workshop was operating at, and was just very like touched and grateful. Like I shared, I wrote 3 of the stories in my book at Clarion, and actually the first story was one of my sub stories. So that kind of showed me, like, my teachers were like, you can submit this. And I was like, oh, really? Okay. You know, like just following their advice. And yeah, I am a person who follows professional advice very like easily. So if someone I admire says, do this, do that, I will like do it and see what happens. So that's my route. Like, I think the point at which I might have just never pursued it was really the point at which I was about to graduate college and ended up going to Clarion. But that could have been a point where I just went really hard into business, and I do both careers right now. So it's still a balance for me, but very grateful to have everything I've gotten in the publishing world.
It's interesting to hear how fan fiction like influenced your writing and your creative process. The next question is actually from a Clarion grad as well. It's from Cadwell Turnbull. For both authors, because the struggle is real, when in the writing process do you do research, and when do you decide when you've done enough?
You want to go? Okay, well, first of all, shout out to Cadwell for his upcoming book, No Gods, No Monsters, which I just finished and which was excellent. So yay. Let's see, how much research do I do? Only as much as I need. And then I quit. Well, so most of my work, I've never come to it blank. I'm trying to think. So for example, for the Mesoamerican inspired world of Black Sun, I have been sort of a Mesoamerican culture stan for over a decade, 2 decades, maybe. I don't know. I've always been, I can't remember when I wasn't interested in, particularly in Aztec history and culture and astronomy. So I sort of knew what I was, I knew my base when I started. And for example, for the Sixth World Series, I was living on the Navajo Nation. So that was a day-to-day, that was my life. That's just drawn from the people and the places and the things that I knew living on the Navajo Nation. But I do specific research. For example, I mentioned that I was going to have a sea captain, and I didn't know anything about sort of the seafaring cultures of Mesoamerica. So I had to do a deep dive into the maritime Maya and, you know, where they sailed, how they built their ships. Did they use sails? Did they use oars? Did they row? Like, what did they do? What were their trade routes like? What did they carry on their trade routes? And, you know, things like that. So I'll do very specific kinds of research. But I'm not the person, I think, that gets like lost in the research. Like, I know there are people who are like, I could spend days reading stuff. And I don't know, maybe you're like that, Isabel, but I'm like, I could spend 2 to 3 hours reading stuff and then I'll just go write my book. Because again, for me, where it counts is the emotionality, is in the character and in the relationships. So those are the things that I'm most drawn to. The rest of it is all in service to that, because I can, and I'm sure there's people who read my books and go, well, you could have done more research, and perhaps I could, but then you may not have gotten that, you know, sort of awesome punch in the gut at the end, you know, when the character does X, you know, so I guess it's just, you have to balance those two out. And character and emotionality is always going to win for me.
Yeah, I'm like, wow, our processes are so similar.
I know, we're very similar.
I think for me, and this is a new thing because I am very not confident with making stuff up in terms of like world building, rules, magic system, like again, and I like to blame my fanfic background on this. Like I don't make canon. I make the intimate moments between characters in canon that happen after the like credits roll, but I don't make the world. Like making world Bibles is not something that you know, I have done in my writing. It doesn't come intuitively to me. And so most of my stories thus far are set in places I know because I don't need to research, you know, I lived in San Francisco. He literally takes the same bus that I took. So I know exactly how it feels to ride that bus, right? But for some reason, all the novels that I want to write are like in outer space or in a secondary world. And this posed a real problem for me because every time I tried writing them, I would like hit a wall where they're just moving through empty manga panels. You know, there's nothing in the background. When they pick stuff up, I have no idea what they're holding. So I realized I did not have enough texture. I need a certain level of canon before I can write these stories. And then I again, I've only done this once. I've only done it in my current story that I'm still slogging through. We'll see if I finish it. But I just like bought a few books on Philippine mythology and legends. Some of them I'd read as a kid and I, you know, picked up the same copy and I read them. And what it did was when I reattempted the story, suddenly I knew more about how the world smells and feels and like what they hold. Just like the terminology, like the vocabulary of the world made more sense to me. And so if there's like a basin of like how much I need to know, AKA the canon that is just in my subconscious, because I'm not writing the story Bible, I would say it's like half filled. And that again, there was like some kind of mystery threshold that I needed to get to. And I think it's inadequate. So like, you know, there are parts like having to do with what they're farming, you know, and I could pause now and watch a lot of videos on rice farming and read a lot about rice farming. And in my brain is like, you should read Braiding Sweetgrass. Maybe that'll teach you what you need to know about farming. Maybe you should read a bunch of farm manuals. And I'm like, yes, but that's just texture. And I think I can pause that for the next draft. So I think I reached my baseline. I'm going to try to write this draft. And then in my revision, if I need to read a rice farming manual, that is the point at which I will do it, but not before. But it is just the gut feel and then like the reattempting. And in future projects, I think, I'm thinking ahead to this next project that I want to write because the future project is always better than the work in progress. And, it has a lot to do with religion. It has a lot to do with like faith narratives, and maybe takes place in a desert-ish place. And maybe the priest is also a farmer. So, I have like a vague sort of like, these are subject areas that I think I need to read up on to reach my baseline thing. Like I need to read about monks, I need to read about Jesus, but then at some point when I feel I have enough, then maybe I'll attempt that story, but that's in the future.
So we have a question from Jen. How important to your process is interaction with other writers? Are you a solitary worker or do you need to share as you work?
You go first.
Yeah, I can go. I think it's really important to have other writers to rant at or just like do sanity checks with. So my writing community is very, very precious to me. And I would say though that it wasn't until last year that I would say I really had a writing group. And for many years I was like, I need a writing group, but I just couldn't find the right set of people. And my current writing group is a productivity group. So we don't critique each other's stories, we just work together, which has worked really well for me. So I love now how productive I am working with this group, but I also like not feeling like at the end of this, I'm gonna workshop it with someone. The workshop method does work for me. I believe in it because I have benefited from it, not just at Clarion, but as an undergrad and then again in grad school, I have taken creative writing workshops that worked for me in both poetry and fiction. And I love critiquing and I love like that sort of like exchange. But yeah, I would say, I write though mostly solo. And for a lot of my work that was published post Clarion, I actually did not really get other people to read it. So like the 3 original stories in the collection, A Spell for Foolish Hearts, A Canticle for Lost Girls, and Syringe, none of those had second readers. It just hits my editor. And that makes me nervous. I think for the book, I will definitely try to get second readers, but I love having my community to like engage with and to freak out with. But the writing for me is pretty solitary.
Yeah, I think for me too. That first writing group I mentioned that I had was very much a productivity group. We would all just sit around in the cafe, adjacent to each other and write. And then like when people would chat, I would get very mad at them. It's like, we are here to work. So I'm sure they loved me. But so I'm very focused when I write. And, so that was like my precious time, right? And I'm a little less so now. And it's sort of interesting. I'm writing for TV. I'm actually in a TV writer's room right now during the day. And that is a collaborative process. You have 6 to 9 people throwing ideas sort of against the wall, seeing what sticks, building on that. It's like the opposite of the solitary novel writer. And so it's very interesting to contrast those 2 experiences and see. I'm not sure which one I prefer. When I'm in the writer's room, I prefer the novel. When I'm stuck in my novel, I'm like, oh, what I wouldn't give for a writer's room. So they each have their pros and cons. I do have a critique group that we meet once a month and critique each other's stuff. And I think what's most helpful for me, like they're sort of like does this make sense check-in group. Like because what always happens for me is I send them like 50,000 words at a time or something, like those poor, very patient people. And so it's not like they can really go, well, this specific scene had problems or something. They're just giving me an overall, hey, plot holes. Does this make sense? Like what's, sort of, did this character seem consistent? Things like that. So they're my check-in group. And then I just love sometimes, not always, but sometimes critiquing other people's work, because you learn what works and what doesn't. Like I think to become a good critiquer is actually like a skill set. And so you learn that like in a workshop, and you learn, it's not about what you want from the story. It's about helping the writer get out of the story what they want from the story. And so I think that helps you overall become a better writer. At least that's my theory. So yeah.
I wanted to add something to this, which is I have 4 friends who sort of like occupy the front row in my mind of like, these are my ideal readers. And this was just a concept that came to me again over the last 3-4 years. I mean, it's been a struggle to write. But when I am feeling uncertain about the story, I'm like, okay, just imagine them, like, would this make them happy? And then in those cases, if I am unsure, because I frequently am, I do send it to like 1 or 2 of them and ask like, is this working or not? And they're my barometer. So it's nice to outsource your barometer of if a story is working or not to certain people. And I'm very grateful for this group. 2 of them I knew from high school. One is a Clarion classmate of mine, and one is an online friend who became a real person friend. So they can come from anywhere, anytime, but it does take work to find them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really lovely to hear about like your writing communities and to hear you as like readers of others writers' works and not just as writers. Our last question is from Marcella, and I think it's pretty relevant, in the pandemic and the times that we're living in. How do you handle the stress and schedules of publishing short fiction while working on longer works? How do you make space for yourself and give yourself grace with writing?
I want to hear about balancing it with the TV writing too.
I don't know. When someone finds out, let me know. I don't know. Well, for the first 2 years, so I published my first novel in 2018. And it has been kind of crazy. So I published, well, let me see. I published my first short story in 2017. And then the novel didn't come until like, I guess a 1.5 years later, but that first short story won a Hugo, won the Nebula and the Hugo. And so things sort of got nuts. And then once you publish a novel, and I don't know, Isabel, if you've gone through this too, with your debut collection, the marketing and like the publicity is relentless. Like it's kind of, they don't tell you about that. You think, oh, I'm an author, I'm gonna write my little book and I'm gonna put it out. It's gonna be great, we're gonna do readings. No. And you don't wanna be ungrateful when you're a debut. You're so, thankful that anyone's even paying attention to you at all. But the demands can be brutal. I mean, I'm sure it varies and from person to person, but I was completely overwhelmed. And by the time that came out, I was still working full-time as a lawyer. I was trying to do some short fiction things because I committed to them on the strength of that first short story, going like, oh, hey, yeah, this is so cool. People want me to write for them. That's, like an anthology. That's so awesome. But little did I know like how brutal the schedule would become. And then now with TV writing, yeah, it's brutal too, because I'm in the room most of the day, and it just takes so much out of you. Trying to be spontaneously creative is harder than it looks. So shout out to those TV writers. So what is the answer to your question? I don't know. I haven't quite figured out how to balance it all. You know what? I have an incredible partner. And he picks up so much of the load for me. Like he sort of keeps me in a space where I can work by doing so many of the mundane things that have to be done to keep a household going. So I think without help, whatever form that comes in, I think it's very difficult, quite frankly. I'm also slowly learning to say no on occasion, which just seems every time like, oh my God, I said no, no one's ever going to ask me to do anything again. I've ruined it. I've burned the bridge. But of course, that's not necessarily true. The bridge can be rebuilt, or you can come back to the bridge later on. So when you're a debut, you don't feel like you have to say yes to everything to the expense or to the detriment of your mental health. You have to find some space where you can pull back, but it's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I feel like my process was much more extended because the stories came out, over several years, and then the book was announced. But it's a single thing, so I'm not on deadline for anything else, and that's given me a lot of room to sort of work on my current draft and sort of like go at my own pace. I cannot imagine going through the book publication process, having a full-time job, and then like having to write on deadline. I've written on deadline before, and I pushed that deadline back 3 times. That was for Hurricane Heels, which was a book I did with Book Smugglers Publishing in 2016. And so I feel like I was able to like chunk up the process without needing like a, explosive debut or anything, which works much better for me. And I don't know how to write a novel. And so that's something that I'm learning now, and it's like kind of mind blowing and very strange and very hard. And gaslighting is too strong a word, but I even had moments where I would talk about what a struggle it was with people, and they would say like, well, you're good at short fiction, like don't force yourself to write a novel. And I would be like, but I want to, but do I really want to? Because it's so hard, and just sort of like spiraling. I thought maybe I would write a novella first and then try to get that published first. Like it just seemed, all over the place. And I took all of 2017 off, for example, because of day job and applying to grad school, which, I needed to, but it was very painful at the end of that time to kind of crawl out of that and be like, oh my God, I haven't written in 12 months and who am I? And so heading into grad school, I found that I could be much more, as you say, great, like giving myself grace with writing, in the sense that like, I really thought to myself, whatever next job I take, I would like to try to make more space for writing in it. I know myself, I know that I go really hard with my day job. And I would like to not let go of writing, because I actually got it back my second year of grad school, because I did 2 writing workshops, and then I found my accountability group. And so I was like kind of in the groove, and then COVID hit, and I was like, oh my God, like I need any job. I finished an MBA program, I need a job. So I was very like nervous going into my job hunt that whatever I found, especially because it looked like I would probably end up in a startup again, would be like, 8 to 7, and then my brain would be fried. Luckily, I do really love my boss in my current company, and it was so awkward to have this chat with her when I was, debating whether or not to take the job. But I was like, I do this writing thing and I like really want to spend more time on it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be lazy. And she was like, I think I get it. Like she had done arts nonprofit before. So she was like, I get it. You don't need to say much more. Like I will ask a lot from you, but you like do what you need to do, because if you are happy and if you are able to do what you enjoy, then I think that's just better for us as a company. So that has panned out. I have become a morning person, which blows my mind, but my writing group is in the East Coast. So I joined them by waking up early. And then I try to write like a paragraph a day before I have to go to work. And that has been the last 8 months for me. So if you have a day job where you're just like completely drained, like the 2 things I would say are like, you might consider looking for another job if that is an option. Or assess your situation objectively. And if you simply cannot do it on like a daily basis, then do it during weekends or do it when you have a break. Like that was my life for 5 years. And sometimes that's just the reality. And it's painful because you feel like you're not making progress. But you know, the reality is the reality. So that's where you have to be really kind to yourself. And the last thing I will say is, like, with working on the novel, if it ever becomes that, I have had to say no to so many ideas, and I have had ideas coming at me, and I have been like, not now, not now, not now. It's hard to multitask. I don't know if other authors do that, but I've never been in this position where I have to spend this long with one project, but that is what the book is demanding. I did take a break and write 2 fanfics since starting the novel, because I was just like, if I don't write it now, this fanfic is going to leave me, and I want it written. But other than that, I have said no to every other story idea, which kills me. But again, I just cannot multitask with the short stories and the book project, which hurts me because in the past it was like, whatever, I'll finish the story in 2 weeks and then like I'm on to the next idea. So I am learning how to, you know, prioritize and just try to give the book. It's so needy, but I'm just trying to get through it right now. Yeah.
Oh, that's a wonderful note to end on. Saying no to ideas is a concept. I love that. And I feel like a lot of people needed to hear that as well. Thank you so much to both of you for coming and sharing this space with us, and to Grant and Book Moon Books for hosting. Our next reading will be on June 1st at 6 p.m. and will be with Leigh Badugo and River Solomon. So make sure to sign up for that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you. It's lovely. Thanks everyone for attending. Hi, Gavin. You can save your ideas, guys. Just put them in a document and visit them again later.
Let's get a really big necklace like Kelly that just says no. And it's really fantastic. And the world doesn't end. I'm so glad.